What's going on, CGs? I'm so glad that you have been able to gather today and have these discussions. We are in our fourth week now of our Questions from God series. And our question for today is coming from Job chapter 38. And we'll be in the whole chapter, but the question is pretty simple. Where were you? Now, before we really dive into that and you start to answer your questions as a group, I'll just challenge you to think personally about this for a second. How do you suffer? And when I say how do you suffer, I don't mean what causes you to suffer. I mean, what is your reaction to suffering? What is your response to suffering? Now, you can ask yourself it really, just give yourself kind of a case study, kind of reflection. When things go wrong for you at work and you get home, how do you talk about what went wrong? Or if things go wrong at home and you're with your friends, how do you talk about what went wrong at home with your friends? Now, it's been my experience personally, and as I've had to pastor students, that typically what people do is they complain. And when they're in a safe spot where there's really nothing on the line for them, they complain in a way that just makes them or solidifies them as the victim in their own minds. I'm not saying that has to be you, but I do know that is the case, and that seems to be something. I'm sure if that's not the case for you, you could think about somebody that does play the victim at pretty much everything. And I think at the heart of that, we start to see that people aren't always giving us the full story about the cause of their suffering. Now, in our passage today, we see Job. We see Job listening to the Lord speak, but it comes after Job had made some pretty harsh statements because he was suffering. Now, Pastor Chris did a great job of laying out all of what has happened, but I'll really kind of boil it down to you in this way. At one point in chapter 9, verses 15 and 29 through 31, we see Job make this accusation. I don't even say it's an accusation. He just makes this comment, offhanded comment about his suffering. He says this about God. He says, "A man gains nothing when he becomes God's friend." Now, we know that Job was a faithful man. We know that he had been through a lot. He was righteous in all kinds of different ways, but he was suffering. And in the pains of his suffering, he made some comments that I'm sure he came to regret at some other point. And we start to see as Job is dealing with this suffering, he does what many of us do. He critiques everyone else rather than reflecting on himself. So I'd ask you this. How do you think God sees your suffering? How do you think God sees how you critique your suffering? Because I think the tendency for us is to always come to these critiques whenever we're suffering by looking backwards and acknowledging all of the consequences and all of the things that led up to us suffering and going through this painful situation. But God invites us to redirect our attention away from looking backwards and direct it upwards. When he asks the question, where were you? He's asking Job to really step up to the plate and evaluate all that has happened and to position himself under the authority, under the power, and under the promise of God. Now, what we see here is as God draws his attention upward, he asks that question, where were you? In verse 4, he says, where were you when I established the earth? But I like even leading up to that in verse 3, what he says is, get ready to answer me like a man. Now, in our culture, if somebody says, talk to me like a man, you tend to think that they're ready to go a few rounds toe-to-toe. Now, God may be saying that, but I don't think that God's ready to pick a fight with Job as much as he's calling Job to not complain, to not critique, but instead to come to him reasonably, in strength, with energy. His answer is important. How we answer God's question, where were you in the face of suffering, is the answer that we give in that situation is going to be the kind of answer that takes us into our relationship deep with God deeper, or it removes us further away from our relationship with God, rather than critiquing and talking bad about God because we're suffering. What God calls us to do is say, hey, look at all that I've done in this world. Look at it from the beginning of time to where we are today, how much I've invested in you, how much I've blessed you. I want you to see that I have been at work in all of this. So see Jesus, as you answer these questions, I would challenge you to take that position today Instead of looking backwards at your suffering and your pain, I challenge you, I invite you to look upwards, to see things from God's perspective. CGs, I pray that you're blessed today. We'll see you later.